do we know? This evening, it is our honor to have with us Professor Geeta Gopinath, who has had an illustrious career as a renowned academician and economist, particularly in the field of international economics and finance. Given her vast experience and background, it would indeed be a rewarding experience for us today to listen to her speak on the topics that she has chosen is extremely topical and important today, that is dollar dominance in trade, facts and implications. Since the good old days of David Ricardo and comparative advantage, it has been more or less accepted globally that trade and the growth in trade is very much a good. It has been accepted sometimes willingly, sometimes grudgingly, but it has been accepted none the same. This has led to institutions like the WTO, the various rounds of negotiations which have led to a continuous growth in international trade, which over the past 30 years and more has in fact outpaced global GDP growth. This trend now, however, seems to have been coming under some amount of threat. There is an increase in political populism, narrow vested interests which are triumphing perhaps over the global good. The very premise of free trade as generating a vastly greater number of winners as compared to a limited number of losers now appears to be under question. Never mind that the question is innocent of evidence and much logic. Protectionism too is beginning to rear its ugly head once again. There appears to be a sense in part, if not much of the developed world, that they may be losing out some of their prosperity, relative or absolute, to the developing world on account of increasing trade. And this perhaps has triggered an appetite for this kind of protectionism. The post-financial crisis global economic slowdown has challenged many of the existing paradigms in economics, and its aftermath has inspired the emergence of many new ideas on international economics and international macroeconomic policy. Some of these ideas, for example, controls on capital movements, taxes on capital movements, have been discussed over the years at some length. Today, the focus is on a set of issues which are relatively new, both in terms of empirical evidence and theory. The theme chosen by Professor Gopinath, that is highlighting the paradigm of dollar dominance, its effect on trade, and its impact on global economic policy. For more than half a century now, the US dollar has been the world's dominant currency. Dominant currency in terms of trade, dominant currency in terms of the composition of national foreign exchange reserves, and in many cases, the dominant currency in terms of international financing as well. Private companies use it for international transactions, banks use it for international lending, and so on. It's important for us to understand this paradigm correctly, as it enlightens us on several fundamental questions in international economics. I am sure that Professor Gopinath would shed more light on these pertinent issues related to dollar dominance in trade this evening. While Professor Gopinath is well known to many of us present in this august gathering, may I, for the benefit of those few others who may not be fully aware, highlight a few aspects of her illustrious career. Professor Geeta Gopinath is the John Zwanstra Professor of International Studies and Economics at Harvard University's Department of Economics. She is also a co-director of the International Finance and Macroeconomics Program at the National
Markets work, and we've learned a lot, and there's been a lot of impact on policy making that will continue to reverberate for the many years to come. So today what I'm going to do is I am going to challenge one very long-standing paradigm in international economics. And my hope is that at the end of this lecture, that you might see the world through a different lens rather than the one that you've kind of carried in your head and that you've worked with for a long period of time. So this is going to be in the space of international trade. And like I said, I'm going to start by challenging a paradigm. So this is going to sound, this is the Mundell-Fleming paradigm. If you've never taken a class in international economics, that's perfectly fine. But that's one of the first things you will learn if you do any bit of international economics is you will learn what's called the Mundell-Fleming paradigm. Okay, so even if you've never heard what the Mundell-Fleming paradigm is, it is what is in your head, and I would say most practitioners, most policymakers, it's what they carry in their head as the relevant paradigm when they answer questions along the following lines. So if somebody were to ask you, how do exchange rate fluctuations impact inflation and trade? You use, even if you don't know it's a Mundell-Fleming paradigm, the way you respond to it will be exactly based on the Mundell-Fleming paradigm. So let's take that question, how do exchange rate fluctuations, I'll come back to that. So how do exchange rate fluctuations impact inflation and trade? Secondly, what exchange rate policy should emerging market central banks adopt? Should they have a fully floating exchange rate? Should they move towards a pegged exchange rate? Should something in between, like a managed float like India has, is that the relevant policy? Or take another question, which is how does monetary policy in the US transmit to the rest of the world? So these are all big, important questions that constantly come up at every point in time. And there's a particular lens through which you answer that question. So let's take the first question, which is how do exchange rate fluctuations impact? Let me actually give you a roadmap before I do that. So this is my roadmap. My roadmap is that first I will, before talking about what's wrong with the paradigm, I'm going to tell you what the paradigm is, so you know what that is. Then I will go into what we see in the empirical evidence and why is it that researchers like me have questioned this paradigm. And then we're going to substitute it with what I'm going to call the dominant currency paradigm, which I think is a much better lens through which to look at the world. And I'll talk about what the policy implications are of the dominant currency paradigm. Okay, so let me first start with telling you what the paradigm is all about, the Mundell-Fleming paradigm. Robert Mundell won the Nobel Prize for this particular paradigm in 1999 for a very good reason. It's a highly influential paradigm. And that paradigm would tell you this, which is that if somebody were to ask you, suppose you're India, the rupee depreciates relative to its trading partners, what are the implications of that for India? This paradigm would say that, well, that should be good for India's exports. India's exports should increase. It should cut back on India's imports from the rest of the world. But there's going to be one downside, which is that it could be inflationary because imports become more expensive in rupee terms, and so that could have an effect on inflation, and that could be problematic. Okay? So that's exactly what the Mundell-Fleming paradigm tells you, and I believe that's exactly what most people would come up with if they were asked, what happens when you have a weaker currency? What happens when a country's currency depreciates? I doubt you will ask too many questions about, which country is it? Is it depreciating relative to the US dollar? Is it depreciating relative to its trading partners? I doubt you will ask whether, is this different if it's the US or if it's China or if it's India? This is a very common set of paradigms that policymakers carry around in their head, and I believe practitioners carry around in their head. So where does this thing come from? Why do we have this sense that a weaker currency is good for export and cuts back on imports and is inflation? Right? So what are the fundamentals? What generates this conclusion? This conclusion is driven by theory, and the theory can be explained in the following way, which is that let's take three countries. You have India, you have US, and you have China, okay? And they trade with each other. The theory that's underlying these conclusions says that when India sells goods to the US, it sets price in rupees, okay? And those prices in rupees don't change around that much. So when the rupee weakens relative to the dollar, it makes Indian exports cheaper in world markets, okay? So that's true when India sells to the US or when India sells to China. The assumption there is that Indian exporters are writing contracts that are in rupees. Those rupee contract prices don't change that much. So when the rupee depreciates or when the rupee weakens, that's going to make the product cheaper in terms of the US dollar for US importers. It's going to make it cheaper in terms of the Chinese yuan for Chinese buyers. And that's why it's going to increase exports to these parts of the world. Okay? And on the flip side, if you look at imports from the US, into India from the US, again, the assumption is that when the US sells to India, it sets prices in dollars, and the dollar price doesn't move around that much, which means that when the rupee weakens, it's going to make all imports coming from the US into India more expensive. It's going to make it costlier, and so they're going to switch it out of imported goods towards domestic producers' output, and so that's going to end up in a cutback in imports. Okay, and that works again with China. When India sells to China, it sets prices in rupees. The rupee price doesn't move that much. When the rupee depreciates relative to the yuan, Chinese importers are going to buy more because it's cheaper. On the other hand, it's going to make more expensive Chinese goods coming into India because these are all priced in yuan.
2, 1,
and what about the
go.
US and China? The assumption in this paradigm
Right 3 continues for 100.
When US sells to
Left 6 over
China,
jump maybe,
it's priced in
100.
dollars. When China sells to the US, it's priced in
Right 6 through dip,
Okay, now if you're a
80.
practitioner, you're an exporter, you look at a picture
Caution,
like this,
left 5 over
how
jump.
do you say this is good?
60.
But this is not the way
Left
India
3
is.
half long, 60.
So it kind of doesn't pass the smell.
Left 4 continues
But once you
past
start
junction,
with this
opens.
assumption, then the set of implications
And
that
left
you have
5.
follow you. Right? So you must remember
Right
that when
4
you are
times to 3,
making this
into immediate turn
but
square
what's
right,
happened
don't
to
cut.
export from country, you have this particular paradigm in the back of your head. Or if you didn't know that, you know
60.
Okay, and this
Right
is, by
5
the way,
half long.
this is not something just of kind of pedagogical.
Into left 6 half long,
It's academic.
60.
This is what Shakespeare
Crest
wants to
into
do.
square left
So
lane,
when
don't
the
cut,
US is
80.
trying to manipulate its currency, engaging in unfair trade practices,
Right
this is
6
the
through
paradigm.
dip, crest.
Because the expectation is that when the Chinese
Into right 5 long,
dollar,
into
that's
left
going to
1 long.
make Chinese products very cheap in the market, so in the US market, and that's going to flood US markets with Chinese products. It's one of the reasons why there's now a push to have currency
Wrong way.
manipulation clauses in trade contracts. So, trade contracts
Turn
we've
right
had
forward,
have
tight.
WTO, which prevents countries from engaging in unfair trade practices through tariffs. But then now there's been a push to say, well, the exchange rate manipulation is another form of a tariff, because if I weaken my currency, I'm
5,
giving myself an unfair
4,
trade advantage.
3,
And so maybe in
2,
our trade contracts, we should also have
go.
currency manipulation clause.
Right 3
that says that
continues
if
for
I'm
100.
Indian Reserve Bank of
Left
India, and I
6
see
over jump
that
maybe,
I'm
100.
manipulating a lot or
Right 6
reserves,
through dip,
that
80.
is a sign that behind is
Caution left 5 over jump,
and that
60. Left 3 half long,
but I mean, it's
60.
not just true for the developed world. It's not just the US that complains about it. The developed countries complain about it too. So very famously, Brazil's
4
finance
continues past
minister
junction, opens.
coined the term currency wars to refer to this phenomenon.
And left 5. Right 4 times 3 into immediate turn square right, don't cut.
Policy is weakening the dollar, and then based on that example, we just
60.
saw a weaker dollar meant that the US was unfairly shifting demand towards US goods away from the rest of the world. Okay, so the rest of the lecture from now until the end is going to be to kind of basically break down this paradigm and say that there are many parts of it that don't survive in the data, if you look at the data, all right? So I'm going to give you what the empirical evidence is, and I'm going to contrast that against the assumptions of the Mundell-Fleming paradigm, which is what I showed you in terms of the triangle. Okay, so the first assumption is the fact that, the Mundell-Fleming paradigm works on the assumption that every country, when it sells its products on the world market, sets its prices in its own currency.
3,
so when India
2,
sells, it sets
1,
prices in
go.
rupees. When the US sells, it sets prices in
Right,
dollars.
3
When
continues
China
for
sells, it
100.
sets prices in That's the
Left 6
assumption.
over jump maybe, 100.
So you can do this. You can say, well, is that true?
Right 6 through
You
dip,
can collect
80.
data on export invoicing to different countries.
Caution left 5 over
You
jump,
see whether how much is it that you see
60.
that each country is using
Left
their own
3 half
currency
long,
in
60.
international trade. And what you see immediately is that
Left 4
the vast
continues past
majority of
junction,
countries do
opens.
not use their own currency in international trade. And they
Left
rely very
5.
heavily on the dollar
Right
as
4
their
times
currency.
3, intermediate turn
So for
square right,
instance,
don't cut.
this was a paper that I wrote for the Jacksonville Symposium in 2015, where what I
60.
did was look at data from countries in the world and look
Right,
at their
5
invoicing
half long.
and to see how much is it that you see of
Into
countries
left
with
6
their own
half
currency.
long,
What you
60.
end up with is you see that the US dollar is used
Into
a whole
square
lot,
left late, don't cut, 80.
which means that if you look at, for instance, dollar invoicing
Right
in
6 through
imports,
dip,
so
crest.
if you look at all imports in the world,
Into
and you look
right
at
5
what
long,
currency they're invoicing.
into
So
left
they
1
could be
long,
dollars or euros or any of the many other currencies.
into
that
turn
group
right
them.
4 tight,
And you look at the US's share in world import. The ratio
and right
of
5 half long,
invoicing
80.
in imports in the world as a whole divided by the US imports is about 4.7.
Right 2 times to 1,
So it's
60.
about close to 5 times, which means there's a whole lot of trade that takes place where the US is on neither side of the
Right,
trade
6 over
transaction,
crest.
neither the importer nor the exporter,
Left
and
4
they're
long,
using the dollar as the currency of transaction.
and
So that was
left
for
2
imports, the same ratio for exports is 3.1.
open, 60.
And by the way, this is not just about commodity prices.
Left
We all
five
know that
long
commodity
over
prices
crest.
are quoted in dollars and the oil prices and copper prices are
Right 6,
quoted in dollars, but this is not that. This is about a whole bunch of other goods.
left 6 continues over jump,
Electronics, pharmaceuticals,
Caution,
many
left
other very
6, jump,
detailed
keep mid.
products in which there is a heavy
Left 6.
reliance on dollar invoicing.
into right 5, don't cut, 60.
Now you can ask, well, is there any other currency that comes close to the dollar in terms of having this kind of excess representation? The next currency that you have is the euro. But the euro share is about 1.2 times its share in world
Turn back
imports
round.
and world exports, which basically means, sure, the euro gets used a lot, but it's almost always when there is some euro country on one side of the trade transaction, either as an importer or as an exporter. It's not used otherwise between country
5,
pairs
4,
where it's not a
2,
euro nation on one side of the
1,
trade transaction.
go.
So there's a big gap between
Right
the
3
dollar
continues
and
for
the euro
100.
in terms of the prominence of
Left
currency.
6 over jump maybe, 100. Right 6
So look,
through dip,
let me
80.
give a specific example of India. India has
Caution, left 5 over
86%
jump.
of its imports are
60.
invoiced in dollars,
Left
while
3
only
half
5%
long,
of its
60.
imports are from the US. So overwhelmingly,
Left 4
everything that
continues
India
past junction,
buys
opens.
is invoiced in dollars, while its trade with the US is 5%. So
And left
under the
5.
Mandel planning paradigm, the assumption under which you kind of
Right
come up
4
with these
times
conclusions,
3
you should
into
have said that
immediate turn square
only
right, don't cut.
5% of India's imports are invoiced in dollars because 5% of its imports come from
60.
But that's not what this is. This is 86% of its imports are invoiced in dollars, while
Right
only
5
5%
half long,
Similarly, if you look at
into
India's
left 6
exports,
half long.
86% of
60.
India's exports are invoiced in dollars, and only 15%
crest
of
into
its
square
exports.
left late, don't cut,
Right?
80.
If this was a Mandel planning paradigm, I guess I could give you a quiz. What percent of India's
Right
exports?
6 through dip, crest. Into right 5 long,
100%.
into
right?
left 1
Because
long.
according to the Mandel planning paradigm, everything that India sells on the international markets
It's turn
should
right
be in
forward,
rupees
tight.
and not in any other currency. So 100% of
And
India's
right
exports
5,
should be
half long,
invoiced in
80.
rupees and 0% in dollars.
Right 2
But that's not
times
the
to
fact.
1,
The fact is that
60.
86% of India's exports are invoiced in dollars, and 15% of those are actually going to this figure over
Right,
here,
6
and it
over
doesn't
crest.
matter if you can't see the names of
Left
countries
4
at the
long.
bottom, but what this is basically comparing
And
is
left
the
2.
amount of each country's imports
Open,
that are
60.
invoiced in dollars relative
Left
to
5
each
long,
country's
over crest.
imports that come from the goods. Okay, so
Right
this is
6.
like India, the calculation for India, 86% imports invoiced in dollars, 5%.
Left 6,
So this is for a
continues
bunch
over
of
jump.
And according to the Mandela paradigm, these two bars, the black and the gray bar, should have the exact same height.
Left 6.
That's what the paradigm would
Into
tell you.
right 5, don't
But that's not what we
cut,
see.
60.
We see that pretty
Turn
much
right
across
2.
the board, the dollar is used very heavily.
Into left 2, opens long.
Where it has nothing to do
And
with
left
goods.
6.
It's not got goods coming. It's good coming.
And right 6. Into
Okay.
left 6.
So once you see this, you kind of ask
Into
yourself,
caution right 5,
it's
tight,
kind of a
don't
bit
cut
bizarre
past
why we
junction.
have this
Into
notion
square left.
that it doesn't matter which country you're talking about, that the weaker currency should
Into
boost
turn
your
right 3.
exports, cut back on imports, bad for inflation. There's nothing symmetrical
left
about this
2
picture.
tight.
This is a very asymmetric picture. It's a picture of an
Into
asymmetric
left
world.
6.
What it tells you is that some
Into
countries
right 3,
have
half long through dip.
very different impact on world markets than other countries do. So in
Into
this
left
example,
3 long.
the Indian rupee doesn't show up anywhere.
Into turn right
US dollar
5,
shows up
60.
everywhere. Now remember, we should expect the US dollar to be important because it's a
Right
large
5
economy.
long. Into
It
right
is a
5 long.
big share of world GDP. It has a sizable amount of world
And hairpin
trade.
right,
But what this is
60.
saying is that its influence on international trade is way bigger than any of those factors. Right? And so
Hairpin
here's a
left.
table where I give you, for a bunch of countries, their reliance on their own currency.
Into right
in
5
international
long.
trade. So for instance, according to the Mandela
And
paradigm,
right
it
5,
should
40
be
past junction to
that
second.
this
Left
exports
3.
should be for every country, it should be 100%.
Right
That
4, don't
100% of their
cut.
exports are invoiced in their own currency. That's what the paradigm should say. So for example,
Into
in India,
left 3, half
that's
long, don't cut, 60.
right at the absolute opposite.
Left 4
paradigm.
long, over crest,
The
keep
only
in.
country that satisfies the Mandela paradigm is the US.
And right 6, 60.
97% of US exports are invoiced in dollars.
Care
What's
hairpin
fascinating
right,
is that you can
100.
come to a country like Japan, right? Japan, which is a reserve currency. It is a safe haven currency. As you know, that whenever there's a crisis,
Left 6.
rush to the yen alongside rushing to the dollar.
Right 6
Only
over bump,
40%
60.
of their exports are invoiced in Japanese. The rest are
Caution
overwhelmingly
right 5
dollars
long,
and in
into
some
hairpin
amount.
left.
So even UK, which is again a reserve currency, only 50% of their exports are in British pounds.
Into left 6, half
So
long,
the
120,
dollar is
over bump dip.
special not just relative to developing countries, it's also very special relative to other developing economies. Okay.
Left 6,
So
and right 6, over bump
you might ask the
60.
question, okay, so what does this picture look like if I were to just replace the figure that I had?
Caution left 6,
What
half
it says is
long,
the world looks
jump
close
to
to
mid, and left 6.
It doesn't matter where you are, everybody seems to be
Into
transacting.
turn acute right,
This is
40
what-
to finish.
As I showed you, there are some developed countries that have reliance on their own currency. But if you have to pick a paradigm, and if you had to approximate the world with a paradigm, this would be a better paradigm, which is the dominance of the dollar. So this is what we call the dominant currency paradigm, the fact that the dollar gets used very heavily in international trade. Okay, so that's one fact that comes from the data that goes against goes against very strongly against the Mandela paradigm. But you can ask yourself, it's not that easy. If all one needed to show was to show the fact that there's a lot of invoicing in dollars, that would not turn any paradigm around. Because you could say, well, sure, when India sells to the US, the export of rice that's on the sheet of paper is in dollars. But effectively, whenever the rupee depreciates, they actually change the dollar price by a lot, cut dollar price. So it could be that effectively it works like the market. Right? So it's not as if the prices are actually in some sense sticky to dollars. They're actually continuously moving the dollar price around when the exchange rate is low. So that's the much harder paradigm much tougher test to pass. So the next set of results that I'm going to show you, where I'm not going to go into details of it, because it's analysis that we have to spend a lot of time going carefully, but let me tell you what the basic takeaway is that the takeaway is the fact that it is indeed the case that prices are sticky in dollars. So it doesn't matter. So when India sells to the US, it is not the case that when they appreciate dollar prices in which they sell to the US goes 1-to-1 down.
Caution slowing into right
It doesn't
5,
do that much.
into
Some
hairpin
will,
right.
but not. So it is indeed the case that up to a first approximation, in the short run, which is about a 1 to 2 year
To left
horizon,
560,
you can
keep
say
right
that
over
the
crest.
prices that everybody's selling to everybody else in the world
Left
is the
6,
dollar price,
dip.
and that dollar price is not moving around much.
Caution right
Okay?
6.
So now if you have
80.
that picture in your
Acute
head,
left 60.
then you can see how that changes our conclusions for inflation. In the following sense, one, you are the US, suppose you're the US, and everything you're importing from the rest of the world
5,
is priced in dollars,
4,
and that dollar
3,
price is not very
2,
sensitive to the exchange rate.
1, go.
Which means the
Left
impact
5,
of
continue to
exchange rate
100 over bump.
depreciations or
Right
appreciations
6,
of the
bump
dollar
dip.
on its inflation is
Caution
very
slowing.
limited.
Into right
Because the
5,
dollar price
into
is
hairpin right.
the dollar price is moving, then, you know, if the dollar weakens, it has a very small impact on inflation.
Into
Think of the
left
extreme
560,
case of the
keep
dollar
right
price
over
doesn't change
crest.
at all. Then it has a zero impact
Left
on
6,
US
dip.
economy. Now flip that around and think of yourself as
Caution right
India.
6,
So if
80.
you're from India's perspective,
Acute
you
left.
would say, well, what happens in
60.
the case of India? And in the case of India, it's completely the opposite, which is that everything India is buying from the rest of the world, 86% of their imports, are invoiced in dollars. That dollar price doesn't move around that much, which means that when the rupee depreciates,
Left 6.
it has, or weakens, it has a very high impact on inflation. Right, so you have a complete asymmetric
right 4 long,
effect of the
60.
exchange rate movement on
Right 3,
India
don't cut.
versus the US. So whenever the rupee-dollar exchange rate moves around,
Into left
it
4.
has huge consequences for inflation,
Into right 3 times
but it
to
has
2,
very
60.
limited consequences for inflation. This is a starkly different
Left
prediction
4,
that you would expect
into
from
left 4,
the paradigm
into
where
acute
it
right.
should be completely symmetric. There should be no asymmetry. And you actually see that in the data. So if you actually estimate the pass-through of
hairpin
exchange
left.
rate movement onto inflation, it's weak in the US, and this has a very strong impact on emerging markets.
5.
The other thing that's
4,
interesting
3,
is that what really
2,
matters for emerging
1,
markets is not
go.
your trade rate.
Left 5, continue to 100
What matters is your
over bump.
exchange rate relative
Right
to the
6,
dollar.
bump dip.
So even if the US is only
Caution
5%
slowing.
of your
Into
trade,
right 5, into
what
hairpin
matters for
right.
your inflation is not the exchange rate relative to all your trading partners, but your exchange rate relative to the dollar.
Into
Because if
left 5,
everybody's
60,
selling to
keep
you
right
is setting
over
a price
crest.
in dollar, the rupee value of that depends on your rupee
Left
dollar
6,
exchange
dip.
rate. It doesn't depend upon all the other movements of exchange rates.
Caution right 6.
So while it's
80.
very standard in policy
Acute left
circles to
60.
try to understand the impact on inflation using the trade-weighted exchange rate, the reality is that you're just going to get a more accurate
6.
measure if you look at exchange rate relative to one country, which is the US. Second, so this is,
5,
might come as a
4,
surprise to several of you,
3,
which is export
2,
expansions following
1.
depreciations output.
Left 5, continue
I know
to
that there's usually a lot of push to weaken a currency because the expectation is that that's going to be good for exports, that that's going to cause you to export more. There's no empirical evidence that supports that, right? That in fact, what you see, including after very large devaluations, that the export expansions following a
5,
weakening of your currency
4,
is actually weak.
3,
Now, so think
2,
of it, why this
1.
makes sense in this way.
Left
Think again of the example of the US exporting, of India exporting to the US. So India exports to the US, it sells in dollars, it sets a dollar price. The rupee depreciates. If the rupee depreciates but the
5,
dollar price doesn't
4,
change much, which is what you
3,
see,
2,
then from the US
1,
buyer's perspective,
go.
Indian goods have not
Left
become
5,
much
continue
cheaper.
to 100 over bump.
And if Indian goods have not
Right
become
6,
much
bump
cheaper,
dip.
there's no reason to switch away from other
Caution
products and
slowing.
goods.
Into right 5, into hairpin right.
And so you should not expect to see any impact on exports, at least in the short term. Correct? So what does this mean?
Into
I mean,
left
is this like
560,
now
keep
telling us
right over
that
crest.
countries don't want weaker currencies?
Left 6, dip.
Does this mean that, okay, maybe we shouldn't be pushing for weaker exchange rates?
Caution right 6,
There is
80.
one dimension along which
Acute
weaker
left,
exchange rates are still good for
60.
the country. So for an Indian exporter selling to the US, even if they don't sell more in terms of quantity,
Left
if
6.
you have a weaker rupee, then that's going to raise the per unit profit that you make on what you sell, right? Because you think about it, if the dollar price stays exactly the same, you have a weaker rupee, then that's going to raise your markup, or it's going to raise your profit margin. So that's beneficial. So it's still very much the case that exporters would like to have a weaker currency, but for completely different reasons.